If you walk in a straight line through the Monongahela National Forest for long enough, you realize the topographical maps are lying to you.
I've been a state land surveyor in West Virginia for 12 years. My day-to-day is entirely mundane. I deal with angry neighbors, arguing over fence lines, reestablish property boundaries set in the 1800s, and occasionally contract with the Forest Service to map out federal tracts. It's grueling work. You carry 40 pounds of gear, a Topcon total station, GPS rovers, wooden stakes, while fighting off ticks and bushwhacking through dense rhododendron thickets. In late October, I was sent deep into Randolph County to survey a disputed boundary near the Spruce Knob area. A private logging firm claimed a specific ridge was theirs. The federal government said otherwise. My job was simple. Hike out to the coordinates, locate the original iron pins driven into the bedrock in 1934, and shoot the azimuths.
This section of the forest is classified as a roadless area. It's rugged, unforgiving terrain, where the canopy of eastern hemlock is so thick it feels like twilight at noon. I was hiking in alone, about 6 miles from where I'd parked my truck on a washed-out logging trace.
Around 2 p.m., a heavy, unseasonal fog rolled through the hollows. The temperature plummeted. I was checking my GPS rover, trying to get a lock on the satellites through the canopy, when the smell hit me.
It was the sharp, acrid scent of hot tar and fresh asphalt. I pushed through a wall of thorny greenbrier, and my boots stopped sinking into the leaf litter. They hit something solid. I looked down, expecting a rock outcropping. It was a road.
Not an old logging path. A pristine, freshly paved 2-lane blacktop. The yellow DOT lines down the center were bright, reflective, and completely untouched by tire tracks. The asphalt was still slightly warm to the touch, radiating heat into the freezing fog. But there were no shoulders, no gravel. The ancient trees grew right up through the edges of the pavement, their roots suffocated by the tar. It looked like a glitch in reality. A highway dropped from the sky into virgin timber.
I checked my GPS. According to the federal database, the nearest paved road was 14 miles west. I keyed my shoulder mic. "Dispatch, this is Miller. I'm out at the Randolph boundary. Have we got an unmapped private inholding out here? A new access route?" Static hissed, and the dispatcher replied, "Negative, Miller. You're in a Class 1 protected wilderness zone. There shouldn't be so much as a dirt bike trail within 5 miles of your coordinates."
Copy that, I said, staring down the dark ribbon of asphalt disappearing into the fog. Just found an anomaly. Going to follow it for a waypoint. The silence on that road was absolute. No birds, no wind, no crunching leaves. Just the squeak of my rubber soles on the fresh tar. After about a quarter of a mile, the trees abruptly gave way to a massive, perfectly circular clearing.
My breath caught in my throat. Sitting in the middle of this clearing was a cul-de-sac with 6 houses. They were modern, 2-story colonial builds with flawless vinyl siding, asphalt shingle roofs, and manicured green lawns. But as I stood there, the wrongness of it began to settle over me like a heavy blanket. There were no power drops connecting the houses to any grid. No utility boxes, no driveways, no mailboxes, no cars. The lawns were perfectly green, but they weren't grass. It looked like outdoor carpet stretched over the dirt. It was a model suburban neighborhood staged in the middle of an ancient forest. Then I saw the people. There were maybe a dozen of them standing in the yards. Men, women, a few kids. They were dressed in normal, modern winter clothing. But they were all standing perfectly still, facing away from me, staring out into the dense, dark tree line on the far side of the clearing.
"Hello?" I called out. Nobody flinched. I took a few steps closer, my hand dropping to the bear spray on my belt. That's when I noticed the tags. Hanging from the collars of their coats, the cuffs of their jeans, the backs of their hats. White retail price tags, fluttering slightly in the cold air. I pulled out my radio, my hand shaking. "Dispatch, this is Miller. I need a county deputy at my coordinates, now."
"Miller, what's the situation?" The moment the dispatcher's voice broke the silence, the people in the yards reacted. They didn't turn around. Instead, in perfect, terrifying synchronization, all 12 of them slowly tilted their heads back, stretching their necks until they were staring directly straight up at the gray sky. Their mouths dropped open, but no sound came out.
I didn't answer dispatch. I turned and sprinted down the asphalt, crashing blindly back into the briars and the dirt, and didn't stop until I reached my truck. I came back the next morning with the county sheriff and 2 armed deputies. We hiked the 6 miles using my exact GPS track. When we reached the coordinates, the deputies looked at me with a mix of pity and annoyance.
There was no road. There was no clearing. Just dense, undisturbed hemlocks and a narrow deer trail. I showed them my GPS data. The breadcrumb trail proved I had walked in a straight line through what was currently an impassable wall of ancient timber.
I still work for the state, but I refuse assignments in the Monongahela. Because sometimes, when I'm driving through real suburban neighborhoods, I catch myself looking at the people in their yards, checking to see if they're looking at the sky. In search and rescue, the most terrifying thing you can hear over the radio isn't a call for a body bag. It's the realization that the person you're looking for is actively hiding from you.
I've volunteered with a SAR team in the Linville Gorge in North Carolina for 7 years. They call it the Grand Canyon of the East. It's a brutal, unforgiving gash in the earth, filled with sheer rock faces, dense underbrush, and trails that simply vanish into cliff drops. When someone goes missing here, the clock ticks faster than anywhere else.
In late November, we initiated a grid search for a 32-year-old hiker named David. He was an experienced backcountry camper doing a solo loop near Babel Tower, but his emergency PLB pinged once and then went dead. By Tuesday morning, we had 30 volunteers, 2 canine units, and an incident command post set up at the trailhead.
I was on the eastern ridge flank. Our protocol is a tight line search. We walk in a straight line, keeping visual contact with the person to our left and right, sweeping every ravine and hollow log. Around 4 p.m., a heavy sleet started falling, dropping the temperature to near freezing. I was exhausted, fighting my way through a thicket of mountain laurel.
Suddenly, my radio clicked. It was our team lead, Sarah. Hold the line. Canine units lost the scent at Grid Sector 4. Everyone stop and listen for acoustic signals. We stopped. The silence in the gorge during an ice storm is heavy. You can hear a branch snap a mile away. I stood there, shivering, straining my ears against the sound of sleet hitting dead leaves.
Then I heard it.
Fweet! Fweet! Fweet!
3 short blasts, the universal distress signal. It was coming from deep within the laurel thicket, about 200 yards to my right, outside our designated search grid. I keyed my mic. "Command,
This is Mark on the right flank. I have a whistle. 3 blasts. Bearing 090. Copy, Mark. Shift the grid. Proceed cautiously. Do not break visual with the line. I checked my compass and pushed through the dense brush. David, I yelled. Search and rescue. Keep blowing the whistle.
Wheat. Wheat. Wheat.
As I got closer, my stomach began to knot up. The sound wasn't right. A plastic survival whistle has a sharp, synthetic trill. This pitch was slightly off. The breath behind it too sustained, too wet. It sounded like a human windpipe forcefully pushing air through raw vocal cords to mimic a whistle. I broke through the laurel into a small, rocky hollow. Sitting perfectly in the center of the frozen dirt was David's bright orange Osprey backpack. It was completely unpacked. His tent, sleeping bag, stove, and clothes were laid out in a mathematically perfect circle. I keyed my radio, whispering, "Sarah, I found his gear. It's laid out in a circle, but I don't have eyes on the subject." Before Command could reply, my radio hissed with a low-power frequency burst. "Sarah, I found his gear. It's laid out in a circle, but I don't have eyes on the subject." My blood ran cold. It was my own voice coming through my radio. But the audio was slightly distorted, flat, completely devoid of the panic I was currently feeling. "Who is transmitting on this channel?" Sarah demanded over the main frequency. "Who is transmitting on this channel?" The dead voice replied, perfectly mimicking Sarah's cadence. I unholstered my bear spray, panning my flashlight across the hollow. "David, we're here to help you."
"We're here to help you," a voice whispered. It didn't come from the radio. It came from directly above me.
I snapped my flashlight up into the bare branches of a massive oak tree. Crouching on a thick limb, 20 feet off the ground, was David. He was wearing nothing but his thermal base layers, completely soaked in freezing sleet. He wasn't looking at me. He was staring straight out into the gorge, his jaw hanging impossibly slack. Blood was dripping from his chin.
David, I yelled, stepping back. "Come down, you're gonna freeze!"
He slowly turned his head to look down at me. His eyes were completely bloodshot, wild, and unfocused. He opened his mouth, and that wet, off-pitch sound tore out of his ruined throat. Fweet, fweet, fweet. The rest of the team crashed into the hollow a minute later. It took 4 grown men to drag him out of that tree. He fought us with terrifying, silent strength, tearing his own fingernails out on the bark. We strapped him into a litter and hauled him out. The official medical report stated he suffered a severe psychotic break due to hypothermia, which caused him to shred his own vocal cords, making distress sounds. But I read the final incident report before it was sealed. When the paramedics were loading him into the ambulance, David stopped fighting, grabbed the EMT's jacket, and forced a whisper through his bleeding throat. "It's learning the radios. You need to turn them off." They don't tell you this in the Forest Service training manuals, but when you spend 70 days alone in a glass box at 4,000 feet, you realize the forest is constantly looking back at you. My name is Arthur, and I spent 4 seasons working as a fire lookout on Unica Mountain in the Cherokee National Forest. It's in extreme isolation. My tower was accessible only by a steep 4-mile dirt service road that required 4-wheel drive and a winch. My only connections to the outside world were a battery-powered Motorola radio
and an Osborne firefinder, a heavy brass topographic alidade used for plotting smoke azimuths. It was mid-August of my third season. The region was in the grip of a brutal drought, pushing the fire danger to critical. I practically lived on the catwalk of the tower, scanning the hazy blue ridges with my binoculars. On a Tuesday evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky a bruised purple, I caught movement in a valley known as Blackwood Ravine. Blackwood is essentially a dead zone. The terrain is violently steep, choked with deadfall, and entirely off trail. There's no water down there, and absolutely no reason for hikers to enter it. I stabilized my binoculars against the railing. Through the lenses, in the fading light, I saw a group of people, maybe 20 of them, gathered in a tight clearing at the bottom of the ravine. Even from 3 miles away, I could tell their proportions were wrong. Their limbs seemed slightly too long, their movements too fluid. They were hauling massive, raw timber logs, old-growth pines that had to weigh hundreds of pounds. But they weren't using machinery, ATVs, or pulleys. They were carrying the logs on their bare shoulders, moving in a fast, synchronized, silent rhythm. No headlamps, no lanterns, just working in the rapidly falling darkness.
I picked up my radio. Dispatch, this is Tower 4. I've got unauthorized activity in Grid 7 Alpha, Blackwood Ravine. Looks like a large group illegally logging or building a structure. Tower 4, say again. The dispatcher sounded skeptical. You have eyes on a group in Blackwood? That terrain is impassable for equipment.
I'm looking right at 'em, dispatch. Heavy manual labor. No lights. Copy, Tower 4. We don't have the manpower to send a ranger bushwhacking in the dark. Keep monitoring. We'll send law enforcement up at first light.
I didn't sleep. I sat on the catwalk in the freezing wind, listening. I couldn't see him anymore, but I could hear him. The sound of heavy timber slamming together echoed faintly up the mountain, a rhythmic, booming sound that vibrated in my jaw. When the sun finally crested the horizon, I put the binoculars back to my eyes. The people were gone. But the structure was finished. It wasn't a cabin or an illegal hunting blind. It was a massive, distorted wooden cage, at least 40 feet tall, built from raw, unpeeled pine logs. The geometry of it was sickening to look at. It leaned at an impossible angle, tapering to a sharp, aggressive point at the top. It looked like a giant wooden spike driven into the earth to hold something down. And suspended in the exact center of this cage, hanging by thick ropes, was a large, dark mass. It was too far away to tell what it was, but it was thrashing violently against the wood. I grabbed the radio. Dispatch, Tower 4, emergency. I need law enforcement and a rescue team to Blackwood Ravine immediately. They built some kind of cage. Something is trapped inside it. Tower 4, calm down. A ranger team is already driving up your service road. They'll be at your tower in 30 minutes. I couldn't wait 30 minutes. I grabbed my pack, my radio, and my sidearm, locked the glass door to the tower cabin, and ran down the metal stairs. I started bushwhacking my way down the mountain toward the ravine, tearing my uniform on briars and sliding down loose shale. It took me over an hour of brutal hiking to reach the edge of the clearing. I burst through the tree line, my gun drawn, screaming, "Forest Service! Is anyone there?" I stopped dead. The clearing was empty. There was no cage. There were no logs. The ground was covered in an undisturbed layer of dead pine needles. There were no footprints, no drag marks, no signs of heavy labor. It was a quiet, empty patch of forest,
My radio cracked. "Arthur, this is Ranger Davis. We're on the catwalk of your tower. Where the hell are you?" "I'm in the ravine," I panted, spinning around, trying to make sense of the empty woods. "The structure, it's gone. There's nothing down here."
There was a long, heavy pause on the radio. When Davis spoke again, his voice was tight, stripped of all its usual authority. "Arthur, you need to hike back up here right now." "Why? What did you find?"
"Your cabin door's bolted from the inside. We had to break the glass to get in." Davis swallowed hard. I could hear it over the mic. "Arthur, there's a raw, unpeeled pine log sitting perfectly in the center of your room. It has to weigh 1,000 pounds. There's no drag marks on the stairs, no footprints, just the log." I never hiked back up to Tower 4. I hiked straight down to the highway and hitchhiked into town. The Forest Service officially recorded the incident as a structural anomaly and quietly granted my resignation. I don't look at the woods much anymore, because whatever they were building down in that ravine wasn't a cage to keep something in. It was a warning to keep us out.
When you find an illegal poaching site deep in the Daniel Boone National Forest, you expect to see bags of shelled corn, commercial salt blocks, or empty brass casings. Not a pristine, fully dressed, twin-sized bed sitting in the middle of a limestone ravine. I've been a state wildlife conservation officer in eastern Kentucky for 9 years. People usually call us game wardens. Most of our winter work is routine. Checking hunting licenses, enforcing bag limits on white-tailed deer, and tracking down illegal baiting stations. It's a lot of solo patrolling across thousands of acres of rugged, sandstone-carved terrain, often hours away from any backup.
In December of 2021, I was working a section of Drake Ridge in Wolfe County. A local landowner had reported hearing centerfire rifle shots late at night, well after the seasonal curtain had closed. I hiked into the hollow around 3 p.m. to deploy a few Moultrie cellular trail cameras near a known deer corridor, hoping to catch the poacher's license plate or face if they were using the old logging traces. The ridge is steep, choked with secondary growth oak and dense mountain laurel. And by 5 p.m., the light was entirely gone, and a biting, dry, freezing wind was blowing through the gaps. I had just finished mounting my second camera to a mature hickory when my phone vibrated in my chest pocket. It was an instant notification from the first camera I'd set up about a mile down the hollow. I pulled it out, expecting to see a buck or a stray coyote triggering the infrared sensor. The thumbnail image showed a man standing 5 feet from the lens. He was wearing a vintage wool blend Forest Service uniform from the 1960s. The old slate green trousers, the structured utility jacket, and the distinct campaign hat. But the uniform was missing all its official patches. Where the federal emblem should have been stitched onto the shoulder, the fabric had been cleanly and meticulously cut away, leaving a jagged, dark hole. He was staring directly into the camera. Because it was an infrared night shot, his eyes reflected the flash as 2 solid, glowing white discs. I keyed my radio to check in with our regional district office. District 4, this is Unit 212. I've got a subject on camera on the north side of Drake Ridge. Appears to be wearing old agency utility gear. Anyone else from forestry or parks out on maintenance tonight? The radio crackled, the signal weak due to the deep sandstone cliffs. Negative 212. All forestry personnel cleared the district at 1600. You're the only state unit logged in that sector. You require county assistance? Negative for now, I said, looking down the dark trail. I'm gonna loop back and check the physical site. I unholstered my Glock 22. Flipped my flashlight onto its lowest lumen setting to preserve my night vision, and
and started tracking back down the hollow. The wind was howling through the bare canopy, masking the sound of my own boots on the frozen leaves. When I reached the coordinates of the first camera, my flashlight beam hit the ravine floor, and my brain simply refused to process what I was looking at.
Sitting directly in the center of a muddy deer trail was a heavy, dark walnut twin bed frame. It was perfectly level. It had a white mattress, crisp cotton sheets, a heavy wool blanket, and a single pillow. It looked like it had been lifted straight out of a suburban home and dropped into the wilderness. And despite the high wind and the blowing dust, the white sheets were completely spotless. No dirt, no leaves, no moisture.
I approached it slowly, my chest tightening. Tied to the footboard with a piece of heavy black utility wire was my trail camera. The strap had been cut. The heavy steel security box I had lag-bolted into a white oak tree had been torn open like a cardboard ration box. The metal was bent outward, showing the sheer physical force used to rip it apart. I checked the bed. On the pillow lay a small, transparent plastic evidence bag, the kind we use for collecting casing fragments at crime scenes. Inside the bag was an old, brass-rimmed paper key tag. Written on it in faded blue ink was a single date: October 14th, 1974. That was the exact date an entire family of 3 had abandoned their homestead on the other side of Drake Ridge, leaving their dinners rotten on the table. The case had gone completely cold 50 years ago. Suddenly, my phone buzzed again in my pocket. A new cellular transmission from the second camera, the one a mile back up the ridge where I had just come from. I forced my shaking hands to slide the screen open. The image was captured less than 30 seconds prior. It showed the same bed, the exact same walnut frame, the white sheets, the wool blanket. It was sitting directly underneath the hickory tree I had climbed an hour ago. And lying flat on the mattress, tucked neatly under the covers, with his slate green campaign hat resting over his face, was the man in the cutout uniform. The second camera was a mile away through impassable sandstone cliffs. There was no physical way to transport a heavy wooden bed frame across that terrain in 30 seconds. I didn't radio dispatch. I didn't take photos of the scene. I turned off my flashlight, broke into a dead sprint through the pitch-black hollow, and didn't look back until I reached the paved county road. The state didn't investigate. When I submitted the evidence bag and the key tag to our evidence locker, the supervisor called me into his office the next morning, handed the items back to me, and told me there was a clerical error in my logs, and that the ridge was being rezoned as a restricted biological reserve.
They pulled my cameras 3 days later, while I was on mandatory administrative leave. I still have the digital images saved on my personal drive. Sometimes, when the wind kicks up at night outside my house, I look out the window, terrified that I'll find a perfectly made bed sitting on my front lawn.
The woods don't just swallow people out here. Sometimes they keep their spaces ready for them. The backcountry permit system in the Great Smoky Mountains is completely automated now. So when a physical slip of paper written in faded fountain pen ink shows up inside a remote trail register, it means someone has been out there far longer than the reservation system has existed. I've been a backcountry law enforcement ranger on the North Carolina side of the Smokies for 11 years. My primary responsibility is patrolling the Lakeshore Trail, a notoriously isolated 70-mile stretch that winds through the historic, abandoned ghost towns that were swallowed up when the federal government flooded the valley to create Fontana Lake in the 1940s. It's an eerie place, filled with old family cemeteries, rusting vehicle chassis from the 30s rotting in the mud, and stone foundations hidden under thick carpets of moss.
In November of 2023, I was doing a compliance sweep near Backcountry Campsite 74, located in a remote watershed near the ruins of an old copper mining settlement called Proctor. The site requires a grueling 12-mile hike from the nearest road, or a boat drop across the lake.
It was a gray, overcast Tuesday. The kind of late autumn day where the air feels wet and smells heavily of decaying pine and river silt. I reached the campsite around 4:30 p.m. It was entirely empty, which is normal for that time of year. I walked over to the rusted iron trail register box mounted on a pressure-treated post near the creek to check the sign-in sheets. Inside the weatherproof box, there was no standard yellow carbon permit log. Instead, there was a single, unlined index card. Written across it in a neat, elegant cursive script was a single line. The inventory is currently full. Please do not add more entries to the register. I flipped the card over. On the back, someone had meticulously hand-drawn a map of the exact campsite I was standing in. Every tent pad, the bare cable system, the fire pit, all of it was perfectly rendered. But in the center of the drawing, right where the main fire pit was located, the illustrator had drawn a deep, perfectly black circle with the words Access Point 3 written underneath it. I looked down at the actual fire pit, 3 feet away. It was cold, filled with gray ash and half-burned charcoal chunks. Nothing looked out of the ordinary.
I picked up my 800 megahertz digital radio to check the backcountry reservation log with the park's communications center. Swain Control, this is Ranger 404. Can you check the digital ledger for Campsite 74? Do we have any active permits or trail maintenance crews cleared for this zone?
The radio didn't click over to the dispatcher. Instead, the speaker emitted a low, rhythmic sloshing sound, like heavy boots wading through deep, muddy water. Then, a voice broke through the static. It was flat, monotone, and sounded exactly like the automated text-to-speech weather broadcasts we get over the NOAA channels.
Ranger 404, please be advised. The water level at Fontana Lake is currently 40 feet above the historic foundations. The residents of Proctor have been relocated to the upper tiers. Do not disturb the inventory.
I frowned, adjusting the squelch dial.
Control, say again. Your transmission is broken. Who is this on the tactical channel?
The radio went dead silent. The wind died down completely, and the temperature in the hollow dropped instantly, turning my breath into thick puffs of white mist. That's when I noticed the sound of Deep Creek had stopped. The rushing water, which had been a constant acoustic background all afternoon, was gone. The creek bed was still full of water, but it was perfectly still, like a sheet of black glass.
I turned around to head back to the main trailhead, my hand resting on my duty belt. Sitting on a log near the edge of the campsite were 2 hikers. They hadn't hiked in down the trail. I would have heard the gravel crunch. They were just there.
They were an older couple, probably in their late 60s, wearing heavy canvas rucksacks, vintage leather boots, and outdated wool knickers that looked like they belonged in a 1970s Sears catalog. And they were sitting perfectly straight, their hands resting on their knees, staring directly at me with wide, completely vacant eyes. Their skin had a strange grayish hue, like the color of river clay.
Ranger,
the man said. His lips didn't move in sync with the words. There was a slight fraction of a second delay, like a poorly dubbed film. Is the county line still where it used to be before the valley went under? The county lines haven't changed, sir, I said, keeping my distance. This is national park land now. I need to see your backcountry permit. You're not logged on the reservation board.
The woman smiled. It was a wide, rigid expression that didn't reach her eyes.
We don't need a permit from the new office. We signed the book back in '42 when they told us we had to leave the valley floor. We're just waiting for the water to go back down so we can go home.
As she spoke, I looked down at their feet. They weren't wearing socks under their leather boots. Through the gaps in the laces, I could see their ankles. The flesh was completely white, waterlogged and pruned, exactly like a body that had been submerged in water for days. I took 2 steps back, my fingers unsnapping the retention strap on my holster. I need you both to stand up slowly and step away from the rucksacks. The man didn't move. He opened his mouth, and that same wet, sloshing radio static I'd heard on my shoulder mic poured out of his throat. The sound was deafening, vibrating through the trees. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I turned and walked backward down the lakeshore trail, keeping my eyes on them until the dense rhododendron closed around the bend. I walked all night, through the pitch black, until I hit the Road to Nowhere tunnel at dawn.
I checked the historical archives at the Bryson City Library the following week. In the 1944 relocation records for the Proctor settlement, there was a photograph of the last family forced out before the Tennessee Valley Authority flooded the gorge. The couple sitting on that log were in the front row of the photo. They were 30 years younger in the image, but they were wearing the exact same canvas rucksacks and wool knickers. The record stated they had drowned in a flash flood while trying to move their cattle across the river 3 days before the dam gates closed. The Park Service closed Campsite 74 last winter, citing heavy bear activity in the area. But I know the cables are still up there, and the register is still mounted on that post. And sometimes, when I look out over the foggy surface of Fontana Lake from the highway lookout, I can hear that flat, automated radio voice counting down the inventory. A flash flood in the Blue Ridge Mountains can tear down an Appalachian hollow and rip up acres of mature timber in seconds. But there is absolutely no hydraulic explanation for a mountain creek completely emptying out in less than 3 frames of a digital flow sensor. I'm a hydrological technician for the U.S. Geological Survey based out of Roanoke, Virginia. My job is entirely data-driven and mechanical. I service the remote stream flow gauging stations tucked deep inside the George Washington National Forest, specifically along the headwaters of the James River Basin. These stations are automated, locked steel shelters positioned next to mountain streams. Inside, a continuous bubbler system measures the water pressure, and a data logger transmits the real-time discharge levels via satellite to our regional office. In October of 2024, my supervisor called me into the station lab to look at a data anomaly from Station 2001, a remote gauge located in the Ramsey's Draft Wilderness area. Every Friday morning at exactly 2:42 a.m. for 3 weeks straight, the hydrograph showed an instantaneous drop in water flow. The stream went from a steady 20 cubic feet per second to absolute zero in less than a minute. It stayed dry for exactly 12 minutes, and then the water returned to normal flow with a massive, violent surge.
It looks like a mechanical failure, my boss told me, pointing at the jagged spike on the monitor. A valve sticking in the bubbler or a software glitch in the logger. Hike up there,
run a calibration test, and swap out the pressure transducer. The hike into Ramsey's Draft is beautiful, but isolated. It's an area of old-growth hemlock and steep, narrow valleys that have never been logged due to the sheer rock cliffs. I arrived at the gauging station, a heavy, green-painted steel box bolted to a concrete pad near the bank, around noon on a crisp, cloudless Friday.
The first thing that caught my attention was the lock.
The heavy American lock brass padlock that secured the steel shelter hadn't been pried open or cut with bolt cutters. The metal had been subjected to such intense, localized heat that it had partially liquefied and then rehardened. The brass had run down the rivets of the steel latch like candle wax, fusing the mechanism into a solid, unmovable lump of metal.
I pulled my cordless angle grinder from my pack, threw on my safety glasses, and spent 10 minutes cutting through the steel hinge just to get the door open.
Inside the shelter, the equipment was intact, but it wasn't running its standard diagnostic loop. The digital display on the Campbell Scientific data logger was dark. The backup lithium batteries were completely drained, their casings bloated and split along the seams, as if they had been hit with a massive electrical surge.
I pulled the physical compact flash memory card from the logger's backup slot and inserted it into my field ruggedized tablet to read the raw data files.
The data stream was normal until the previous Friday at 2:42 a.m. At that exact second, the text files stopped recording numbers. Instead, the data code was replaced by thousands of lines of a single, repeating sentence. The channel is being cleared for transit. Please keep the line open.
I felt a cold prickle of adrenaline hit the back of my neck. I looked through the small plexiglass window of the shelter down into the stilling well, the vertical concrete pipe that routes the creek water into the sensor chamber. The water inside was clear and flowing normally over the limestone rocks.
I decided to hike upstream to find the physical source of the blockage. About 2 miles up the hollow, the trail crosses an old, forgotten timber splash dam from the late 1800s. It's a massive wall of hand-hewn hemlock logs and packed earth that the old loggers used to back up water before releasing it in a massive surge to float timber downstream.
The air grew noticeably colder the closer I got to the structure. The birds had stopped singing, and the only sound was the crunch of my own boots on the shale. When I broke through the hemlocks into the dry pool basin behind the old dam, I froze. The creek bed above the dam was completely bone dry. The water didn't just stop flowing, it had vanished. But the mud at the bottom of the channel wasn't normal forest silt. It was covered in thousands of small, perfectly round, identical indentations. It looked exactly like someone had taken a common glass marble and pressed it into the soft clay over and over again, thousands of times, creating a dense, geometric honeycomb pattern that stretched up the creek bed as far as I could see. And sitting perfectly upright, in the middle of this patterned mud, was my old childhood Schwinn bicycle. It was blue, with the rusted chrome fenders and the torn vinyl seat. It was the exact bike that had been stolen out of my parents' unlocked garage in Ohio when I was 11 years old. My name was still scratched into the paint on the crossbar with a pocket knife fragment. The tires were flat, but the metal was entirely free of mud or rust, as if it had been stored in a vacuum-sealed room for 25 years. I took out my field phone to take a photograph, but the screen was experiencing severe digital artifacting, bright green and purple lines rolling across the camera lens display. Then, a low, deep vibration started in the ground beneath my feet. It wasn't an earthquake. It was a rhythmic, mechanical thrumming that felt like a massive pump operating deep within the mountain bedrock. From the dark, narrow rock crevice where the creek spring originated further up the ridge, the water began to return. But it didn't flow like a stream. It came out in a slow, thick, perfectly uniform black wave. It didn't splash over the rocks, it slid over them like liquid oil, filling the marble-patterned indentations with a heavy, dead silence.
I dropped my pack, scrambled up the steep shale bank of the ravine, and didn't stop moving until I hit the state highway 3 hours later.
I submitted my field report that evening, omitting the detail about the bicycle, but including the ruined data logs and the melted lock. 2 weeks later, the USGS officially discontinued Station 0201, citing unstable channel geomorphology and shifting the district boundaries to the eastern ridge.
I still work the hydrologic circuits, but I don't go into the wilderness zones alone anymore. Because every time I run a streamflow calibration test on a quiet mountain creek, I find myself staring down into the water, terrified that the current will stop. The marble patterns will appear in the mud, and I'll see something from my past looking back up at me through the dry gravel.
The streams out here aren't just drainage networks. They're corridors. And whatever's clearing the channels doesn't like to be watched while it moves its inventory. We have 4 more accounts left to document from the state archives. Let's move to story 7, where the things left behind in the high ridges don't match the maps we were given.
If you spend enough time analyzing remote audio data from the deep woods, you get used to filtering out the wind, the coyotes, and the occasional poacher. But you never get used to an automated recorder capturing 30 minutes of a digital kitchen timer ticking in a hollow located 5 miles from the nearest power line.
I work as a bioacoustics technician for the West Virginia Department of Natural Resources. My entire job revolves around monitoring wildlife populations by analyzing sound. We deploy automated recording units, specifically wildlife acoustics song meter SM4s, in remote sectors of the state to track bat migration patterns, bird nesting habits, and the spread of invasive species. They're small, weatherproof gray boxes strapped to trees, left alone for months at a time to record ambient audio onto high-capacity SD cards. In September of 2023, I was tasked with retrieving 4 units from a heavily choked off-trail valley in Logan County, known locally as Dingus Rum. The terrain is brutal, characterized by steep, jagged ridges, loose shale, and dense carpets of stinging nettle and greenbrier. It's the kind of place where you can break an ankle and not be found for weeks.
I reached the coordinates for the 3rd unit around 2 p.m. The recorder was strapped to a mature tulip poplar about 50 yards above a dry creek bed. Everything looked normal from the outside. The zip ties were intact, and the foam windscreens on the omnidirectional microphones hadn't been chewed on by squirrels. I swapped the batteries, pulled the 512GB SD card, logged the waypoint on my Garmin GPS, and hiked out.
The real trouble started 3 days later when I loaded the raw wave files into my audio analysis software back at the lab in Charleston. I was running the audio through an automated classifier script to detect the high-frequency clicks of Indiana bats. The software visualizes sound waves as a spectrogram, a digital graph that maps frequency over time. While scrolling through the visual timeline from the night of August 14th, I noticed a massive, abrupt anomaly.
At exactly 3:14 a.m., the entire forest went completely dead silent. The ambient white noise of the crickets, the cicadas, the distant rustle of the leaves dropped to absolute 0 decibels. It looked like a clean vertical cut on the spectrogram, as if the microphones had been unplugged. But the unit was still recording.
3 seconds into the silence, a new frequency spike appeared. It was a sharp, electronic, high-pitched beep, beep, beep. It was the unmistakable sound of a cheap digital kitchen timer counting down. The sound didn't fade in or out. It was crisp, clear, and perfectly centered between the 2 stereo microphones. The timer ticked rhythmically for exactly 12 minutes. Then, the audio picked up the distinct, heavy sound of a wooden chair dragging across a linoleum floor.
I put on my studio headphones and cranked the gain up, filtering out the low-end hiss. Through the headphones, I could hear the rhythmic swish, swish of a corn straw broom sweeping across hard floor. The sweeping sound moved slowly around the tree where the recorder was mounted, circling it 3 times. The entire time, the forest around the clearing remained in that impossible, vacuum-like silence. No wind, no insects, just the digital timer and the broom. Then, the sweeping stopped right beneath the microphone. The next sound that registered on the track made me physically pull the headphones off my ears. It was a wet, heavy, rattling breath, taken less than an inch from the foam windscreen. It was followed by a flat, monotone human voice, a woman's voice, completely devoid of any regional Appalachian accent. She spoke 5 digits into the microphone. Inventory sequence 0, 9, 3, 4, 7. Immediately after the last digit, the forest ambient noise snapped back into existence on the spectrogram like a flipped switch. The cicadas were roaring, and the wind was blowing again. I pull up the metadata for the file. The unit's internal diagnostics showed no software glitches, no battery drops, and no hardware failures during that 3-hour window. The next morning, I drove back out to Logan County. I needed to see the physical side again. I hiked the 4 miles back into Dingus Rum, pushing through the brush until I reached the tulip poplar. When I broke through the final thicket, I stopped dead. The tree was there, but the bark had been entirely stripped away. From the root flare all the way up to the first branch line 20 feet in the air, the poplar had been cleanly, meticulously peeled bare. The raw wood underneath was still pale and damp, dripping with sticky sap. The automated recorder was gone. The heavy plastic zip ties had been cut with something incredibly sharp. Sitting on the flat stone, directly beneath the stripped tree, was a heavy, vintage cast iron skillet. It wasn't rusted or covered in leaves. It was sitting perfectly level, filled to the absolute brim with clear, cold well water. Resting at the bottom of the skillet, completely submerged, was my recording unit. The housing had been cracked open, and the internal circuit board had been cleanly snapped in half. I didn't collect the skillet. I turned around and walked out of the hollow, my hands gripping my bear spray. When I submitted my field report, the department administration took the broken unit, marked the file as unrecoverable media due to black bear vandalism, and transferred me to a watershed monitoring project on the eastern panhandle. But I still have the backup spectrogram image saved on my phone. Sometimes, when I'm working late in the lab and the room gets completely quiet, I swear I can hear the faint, rhythmic ticking of a digital timer starting up behind the drywall. A solid concrete cap poured over an abandoned vertical coal mine shaft in 1974 isn't something that can settle, shift, or
crack into a perfect human-sized octagon.
I work as an environmental inspector for the Virginia Department of Energy's Abandoned Mine Land Program. My job is to locate and evaluate old, unmapped mine workings from the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Southwest Virginia is literally hollowed out like a honeycomb. There are thousands of old coal portals, air shafts, and haulage tunnels rotten beneath the ridges of Wise and Dickinson counties. Most of the time, we find standard hazards: acid mine drainage, orange stain in the creeks, minor sinkholes, or rotten timber portals that need to be sealed with foam or concrete caps to keep local teenagers from wandering inside.
In November of 2024, I was sent to a remote ridge near the town of St. Paul to verify the integrity of an old ventilation shaft. According to our agency's microfilm records, the shaft belonged to the old Banner Coal Company, driven 200 feet straight down into the mountain in 1941, and officially sealed with an 18-inch thick slab of steel-reinforced concrete in 1974. The shaft was located on a steep, heavily wooded bench about a mile off an old logging road. The mountain was locked in a bitter late-autumn freeze, the ground hard as iron and covered in a light dusting of frost. I carried my standard field kit: a gas monitor, a high-lumen tactical flashlight, a digital camera, and a laser rangefinder. When I located the cap, I immediately pulled out my field notebook. This wasn't a standard maintenance issue. The concrete slab hadn't degraded due to weather or root intrusion. Instead, something had cut a flawless, geometric octagonal opening right through the center of the 18-inch reinforced concrete block. The edges of the cut were completely smooth, almost polished, as if a massive industrial water jet or laser had sliced through the rock and the internal steel rebar like butter. There was no concrete dust, no rubble, and no debris resting on top of the cap or around the opening.
I unclipped my industrial scientific multi-gas monitor and extended the sampling probe over the open hole. I expected the internal pump to start chirping immediately, warning me of black damp, the low oxygen, high carbon dioxide air that pools in old unventilated mines. The monitor screen blinked. The oxygen level was a perfect 20.9%. Methane was at 0. Carbon monoxide was at 0. But the sensor's unknown organic compound indicator began to cycle rapidly, displaying a completely erratic, high-amplitude reading that the software couldn't classify.
I knelt at the edge of the octagonal opening, clicked my flashlight onto its maximum 3,000 lumen setting, and aimed the beam down into the darkness of the shaft. The light traveled down the hand-cut sandstone walls of the ventilation shaft for about 80 feet, and then it hit a horizontal surface. My brain stalled as I looked through the lens.
The bottom of the shaft wasn't water, mud, or a pile of collapsed shale. The flashlight beam was illuminating a pristine, highly polished oak hardwood floor. The tongue and groove planks were perfectly laid, reflecting the white light of my flashlight like the floor of a modern suburban home. And sitting directly in the center of that illuminated wooden floor, precisely aligned under the octagonal opening 80 feet above, was a pair of men's leather dress shoes. They were black, shined to a mirror finish, and positioned as if someone was standing in them, heels together, facing the blank sandstone wall of the shaft. I pulled back from the edge, my breath catching in my throat. The cold air of the mountain ridge suddenly felt thick, heavy, and smelled faintly of floor wax and old wool. I uncoiled my 50-meter spool of high-tensile paracord and tied it securely to the lanyard loop of my backup flashlight. I needed to get a closer look, to lower the light down to verify what I was seeing before I called in a structural emergency to the regional office. I slowly lowered the flashlight through the octagonal hole. The
the light descended smoothly. 40 feet, 60 feet, 70 feet. I watched the beam narrow as it approached the polished oak floor.
At exactly 75 feet, 5 feet above the shoes, the paracord went completely slack in my gloved hands. It didn't feel like the light had hit a solid surface. It felt as if the weight of the tool had simply been cut from the line. I quickly hauled the cord back up, pulling it through my hands. When the end of the line emerged from the hole, I froze. At exactly 75 feet, 5 feet above the shoes, the paracord went completely slack in my gloved hands. It didn't feel like the light had hit a solid surface. It felt as if the weight of the tool had simply been cut from the line. I quickly hauled the cord back up, pulling it through my hands. When the end of the line emerged from the hole, I froze.
A fraction of a second later, the internal speaker on my gas monitor, which is only designed to emit high-pitched warning chirps, cracked with a loud pop of static. A faint, distant voice came out of the tiny plastic grill. It was a man's voice, muffled, sounding as if he was speaking into an old rotary telephone from another room.
The floor is finished, Marcus. You can come down now. My name is Marcus. I had never worked this district before, and I hadn't logged my name into the county dispatch system that morning.
I dropped the rope, grabbed my kit, and walked quickly back down the ridge. I didn't run. Running on loose shale in a freeze is how you break a leg. But I didn't stop until the truck engine was running and the doors were locked.
The state sealed the St. Paul portal 2 weeks later. They didn't use a standard concrete pour. A private contractor from outside the county came in with 2 concrete mixers, filled the entire shaft with low-density cellular grout from top to bottom, and recontoured the hillside with bulldozers. The official project ledger listed the site as an unstable subsidence emergency.
I transferred to an administrative desk position in Richmond 3 months later. I don't go into the field anymore. Because sometimes,
When I'm walking across the hardwood floors of my own house, I feel a slight vibration beneath my feet, and I can't help but wonder how much concrete is actually separating my living room from the shafts below.
When a remote microwave relay tower stops transmitting, the diagnostic log usually indicates a blown surge protector, a dead generator battery, or a fallen tree line. Not a sudden massive increase in the physical weight of the structure itself. I'm a telecommunications field engineer for the West Virginia State Police Communications Division. My department's responsible for maintaining the P25 trunked radio network.
The critical line of communication used by every state trooper, county deputy, and wilderness park ranger in the state. Our towers are located on the highest, most isolated peaks in the Allegheny Mountains, often inside restricted federal land or near the boundaries of the Greenbank Radio Quiet Zone, where cellular signals are completely illegal to prevent interference with the radio telescopes.
in July of 2025, during a week of severe summer thunderstorms, a vital repeater site on Sharps Ridge in Pocahontas County went completely dark. The remote monitoring system at our central shop in Elkins didn't just report a loss of signal, it flagged a catastrophic mechanical failure.
The structural strain gauges, sensors mounted on the tower's 3 heavy steel guy wires to measure wind load, were reporting that the cables were under 90,000 pounds of tension. That's double the maximum breaking strength of the steel.
I hooked up our heavy-duty utility trailer to my 4x4 diesel truck, loaded my tools, an Anritsu spectrum analyzer, and a replacement transmission line, and started the 3-hour drive up the mountain.
The final 5 miles required navigating a narrow, washed-out Forest Service fire trace that hadn't been maintained since the 90s.
The storm had passed, leaving the mountain locked in a heavy, humid fog that clung to the old-growth spruce trees. The air was thick, suffocatingly hot, and buzzed with horseflies.
When I finally reached the summit clearing, I didn't even get out of my truck. I just sat behind the wheel, staring through the windshield.
The chain-link security fence surrounding the facility compound was completely distorted. The heavy steel posts hadn't been pushed inward by a fallen tree. They were bent outward from the center of the compound at an exact 45-degree angle, as if an immense, invisible pressure wave had radiated from the tower base. I unholstered my state-issued sidearm, stepped out of the truck, and immediately noticed the sound.
The guy wires weren't snapping. Instead, the 3 massive steel cables stretching from the ground anchors to the top of the tower were vibrating so violently they were producing a deep acoustic hum, a low industrial frequency that resonated right through the soles of my boots and made the fillings in my teeth ache. The air inside the compound felt thick, like walking through water, and every hair on my arms was standing completely on end from static electricity.
I walked over to the concrete equipment shelter. The heavy, windowless steel door was unlocked. When I pulled the door open, a wave of freezing air hit me in the face. The temperature inside the shack had to be well below zero. The concrete floor and the green metal equipment racks were covered in a thick, crystalline layer of white rime frost. My breath immediately turned into thick plumes of vapor.
The Motorola radio decks were powered on, but their liquid crystal displays weren't showing the standard active channel profiles. Every single screen was glowing with a solid, deep cobalt blue light. No numbers, no text, just blue. I unzipped my field jacket, shivering violently, and hooked my portable spectrum analyzer into the main coaxial antenna test port to locate the source of the network block.
The digital screen of the analyzer booted up, calibrated, and then displayed a wave pattern that defied every law of radio physics I've spent 20 years studying. The RF floor wasn't showing noise or interference. It was displaying a perfectly flat, clean line that dipped down into a negative decibel frequency, a mathematical impossibility. It was absorbing the ambient radio waves of the entire valley, pulling them into a dead block. Suddenly, the hum outside changed pitch. Clack, clack, clack. It was the sound of the 3-inch steel turnbuckles on the guy wire anchors slowly, rhythmically unscrewing themselves. I ran to the door of the shelter and looked out into the foggy clearing. The 150-foot lattice steel tower wasn't falling over. It was compressing. The heavy steel struts and cross braces weren't snapping or bending outward. They were folding into each other smoothly. The solid metal liquefying and merging like hot wax, pulling the massive structure down into a dense, compact cylinder of solid steel only 20 feet tall, and sitting perfectly level on the very top of that crushed, smoking metal spire was a neat, dry stack of official West Virginia State Police incident logs from June of 1982.
The papers weren't yellowed or dusty. They were crisp and white. Every single log sheet was completely blank, except for the signature block at the bottom of the page. They were all signed by a trooper named Alan Vance, the exact name of the officer who had gone missing during a routine patrol on Sharps Ridge 43 years ago and was never found.
I didn't run diagnostic tests. I didn't save the analyzer data. I backed out of the compound, jumped into my truck, and slammed the transmission into reverse, tearing down that mountain road until I hit the paved state highway.
The state didn't rebuild on Sharps Ridge. The Communications Division officially decommissioned the site, citing unrecoverable electromagnetic geological interference, and rerouted the P-25 trunk lines through a tower 3 ridges over.
I still manage the network circuits from the main office, but I don't go up to the high ridge summits after a storm anymore. Because every time the telemetry logs show a minor power drop at a remote site, I find myself checking the tension gauges, terrified that the numbers will start rising, the frost will appear, and the radio channels will start clearing themselves for a guest who hasn't finished his patrol.
We have one final closed file account remaining from the backcountry records. Let's move to story 10, where the lines drawn on our topographical maps don't match the boundaries of the things that live between them.